The rain came in from the west that night, the way it always did before the worst of it, smelling of wet stone and coal smoke, and something colder underneath, like iron left out in frost. Renwick Hall stood at the end of its long drive, with half its windows dark, and the wind found every gap in the old stone, and made a low sound in the chimneys that was almost, but not quite, a voice. Hester Quill was the kind of woman a room forgot the moment she left it. She was not pretty in any way the house would have remarked on, and she was not plain enough to be pitied for it either. She had red knuckles from lye soap, and a way of standing very still when she was thinking, so still that she was sometimes mistaken for a piece of furniture by gentlemen who did not look twice at scullery maids. She had one gift, and it was not a decorative one. She knew fever. She knew it the way her mother had known it, from years spent at a healer's elbow in a village too poor to keep a proper doctor. And she knew, without needing to be told, that the smallest of the 3 Farrow infants was not going to see morning if something did not change before the church bell rang for 6. She had not been hired to know this. She had been hired to scrub pots and carry coal and keep to the kitchen passage, and if anyone had asked her that first week at Renwick Hall what she thought of the nursery, she would have said, truthfully, that she had never set foot in it. The house did not know yet that this was going to be the night that changed it. Houses rarely do. They only know, afterward, that something in them shifted. The way a bridge does not announce the exact hour it begins to fail. It simply groans a little differently, and if no one is listening, no one hears it until it is too late. The Duke of Renwick had been gone from his own house for 6 months. He had left 3 days after they buried his wife, and he had told no one when he meant to return. His grief did not have a memorandum. It came to him at Renwick Hall in Berkshire, the way it had followed him across 2 countries, at 3 o'clock in the morning, sharp and total, and on this particular night it came to him in an inn 40 miles from home, with such force that he had his horse saddled before he understood why. He did not send word ahead. He rarely did any more. He had learned, in the 6 months since his wife died, bringing 3 sons into the world at once, that arriving unannounced told him more about a house than any report ever could. Servants behaved for masters they expected. They behaved for no one the way they behaved when they believed themselves entirely alone. He was 30 and 2 years old, and grief had put 10 years on his face that his birth certificate did not account for. He was not a handsome man in the way ballrooms meant the word. His nose had been broken once, badly, in a riding accident no one spoke of any more, and his eyes were grey and tired and almost always thinking. He rode into his own courtyard a little before midnight, with the rain coming sideways, and no one at all to greet him, because no one knew to expect him, and he told the one stable boy still awake to say nothing, to no one, until morning. The house he walked into was dark and cold, at the edges the way great houses always are, no matter how many fires burn in the rooms that matter. He climbed the back stair out of habit, the one the family rarely used, because it was closest to the nursery, and because some part of him that he did not examine too closely had ridden 40 miles in the rain to be near his sons before he was near anything else. He did not expect to find the nursery lit. He did not expect to find it occupied by anyone but the night nurse he was paying a considerable sum to sit there. He found neither what he expected nor what he feared. He found something else, and it stopped him in the doorway with his coat still dripping onto the floor, unseen, unannounced, and entirely unable to make himself step forward. There was no nurse in the room. There was a girl in a maid's plain grey dress, sleeves pushed to the elbow, kneeling on the bare boards beside the smallest cradle with a basin of water in front of her and a cloth in her hand, and she was sponging the fevered brow of his youngest son with a patience that had clearly been going on for hours. Because her knees had worn a damp patch in the floorboards, and her hair had come loose from its pins, and she had not stopped to fix it. She was not singing loudly. She was not singing for anyone. It was low, almost nothing, a tune he did not recognize, the kind of thing a woman hums to herself when she has forgotten she is making any sound at all. She had given her own shawl, he saw, folded twice over, to the middle child, who slept with his small fist curled into the wool of it. The fire had been built up higher than the house allowed for servants' quarters, and he understood, watching her feed another log to it, with her bare hand shielding the flame from the draught, that she had done this herself, without calling anyone, without waking anyone, without seeking permission from a single soul in the house. The nurse, he would learn later, had gone down to the village 3 hours before, and had not come back. The girl kneeling on his nursery floor had no business being there at all. She was not the nurse. She was not even the underlaundress with any claim on the nursery wing. She had simply heard, on her way up with an armful of clean linen at 10 o'clock, a sound through the door that she recognized, because she had heard it before, in a cottage far from here, from a smaller and dearer body than this one, and she had set the linen down in the passage and gone in. He stood in the doorway, and did not move, and did not speak, and the rain ran off his coat onto the boards behind him, and he watched a woman he had never seen before in his life save his son's life with nothing but water and patience and a stolen blanket and no one in the world to see her do it. She did not know he was there. She would not know, not that night, not for some time after it, that the man standing soaked and silent in the doorway of his own nursery, watching her with an expression she would not have recognized on any face she had ever served, was the Duke of Renwick himself, home 12 hours before anyone in the house believed he would come, and that what he saw in the next quarter of an hour would matter more to the shape of her life than anything that had happened in it before. The fever broke a little after 1. She did not know exactly when. She only knew the small body under her hand had stopped fighting the cloth and gone loose and warm instead of loose and cold, and that the breathing had changed from the thin catch it had held all evening into something slower and rounder. She sat back on her heels and pressed the back of her wrist to his brow the way her mother had taught her, and felt the difference and let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She did not cry. She had trained herself long ago not to cry where it showed, and there was, in any case, no one there to see it, or so she believed. She rinsed the cloth and wrung it, and laid it over the basin's edge, and only then did she look up, meaning to check the fire, and see the shape of a man filling the doorway with rain still running from the hem of his coat onto her floor. She did not scream. She did not startle in the way that would have made noise enough to wake 3 sleeping infants she had spent 4 hours settling. She went very still instead, the way she always did when she was frightened, and looked at him and said nothing, because she did not know who he was, and every instinct she owned told her that a strange man in a wet coat, standing in a nursery at 1 in the morning, was not, whatever else he might be, good news for a maid caught out of her station. He spoke first. His voice was low and rough with the road. "Who sent you here?" "No one, sir," she did not rise. She kept one hand near the cradle rail, not touching it, simply near. "I was passing with the wash. I heard him crying wrong. Not the ordinary crying, the fever crying, and the nurse. Gone down to the village, sir. I don't know when she means to be back. He looked at the basin, and the cloth and the shawl folded over the middle child, and the fire built up past what any housekeeper would have sanctioned for a scullery maid to arrange on her own authority. And something moved in his face that she could not read, because she did not yet know his face well enough to read anything on it at all. You've been here how long? Since 10, sir, perhaps a little before. Alone, yes, sir. He said nothing for what felt to her a very long time. The fire popped once, and settled, and somewhere out past the window a rook called, though it was strange to hear a rook at that hour, and the sound of it seemed to decide something in him, because he stepped further into the room at last and looked down into the smallest cradle himself. He was crying like that when I left for the north, he said, very quietly, not entirely to her. I did not think I would come home to worse. She understood then, with a small cold drop in her stomach, exactly who she was speaking to, and she came up off her knees at last and dropped into the deepest curtsy her tired legs could manage, and began, in a rush, the apology she was certain the moment required. Your Grace, I ought to have sent for someone. I ought not to have touched him without leave, I only thought. There wasn't time to find anyone who stop. It was not unkind. It was simply absolute, the way his sentences tended to be, she would learn, when he meant them entirely. You saved my son's life tonight. I am not in the habit of receiving apologies for that. She did not know what to say to this, and so she said nothing at all, and stood with her hands clasped in front of her damp apron, and waited, because waiting was a thing she had grown very good at. He asked her name. She gave it. He asked whether she had eaten. She had not since noon, and she told him so only because it seemed a greater sin to lie to a duke than to admit hunger, and something in his face, briefly, was almost gentleness, though it left as quickly as it came, folded back under the grave watchfulness that seemed to be his ordinary weather. Go to bed, Miss Quill, he said. I will sit with them the rest of the night. Your Grace, you've ridden through the rain. You ought to. I have slept in worse than a nursery chair, he said, and there was, for half a second, something almost like humour at the corner of his mouth, gone before she was sure she had seen it. Go and sleep. You have done more tonight than anyone in this house has done for these children in 6 months, myself included. She did not know then that he meant that last part more literally than she understood, that he had spent those 6 months unable to look at 3 infant faces without seeing the wife he had lost delivering them, and that the guilt of his absence had ridden with him every mile of the road home. She did not know that the man dismissing her so gently to her bed had, an hour earlier in a rain-soaked-in yard, been unable to say why he was suddenly certain he must come home that night, of all nights, and would spend a long while afterward believing it had been something in the boy's blood calling to his, and never once suspecting that what he had truly come home to see was not his son's fever breaking, but a stranger's hands breaking it for him, unbidden, unpaid, and utterly unwitnessed by anyone she believed would ever know. She did not curtsy again. She only bowed her head once and went, and left him alone with his sons and the dying fire, and the basin she had filled and emptied without once, in 4 hours, thinking of herself. She woke the next morning certain she had ruined everything. It was the first thought in her head before her eyes were fully open, the way bad news often is, and it stayed with her through washing and dressing, and the long, cold walk down to the kitchen passage, where she expected, at the very least, a scolding from Mrs. Pruitt for abandoning the wash-basket in the upstairs hall, and at the worst, her notice. Mrs. Pruitt was the housekeeper at Renwick Hall, and had been for 11 years, and was known below stairs for two things in equal measure: a competence that missed nothing, and a dry warmth that revealed itself only to those she had decided were worth the trouble. She looked up when Hester came in, and studied her for a long moment over the rim of her spectacles, and said nothing about the wash-basket at all. "You'll take your breakfast standing, girl. His Grace wants the nursery properly staffed by noon, and I've had Mrs. Dunmore's notice written before she's even had the grace to come home and hear it." Hester's stomach dropped. "Mrs. Pruitt, I never meant to see her turned off, You didn't turn her off. She turned herself off, 3 hours down at the Bell and Anchor, with a soldier who'd have said anything to keep her buying his ale, while 2 infants and a fevered one lay in a room, with no one in it but the fire." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth thinned. "I'll not pretend to you that I'm sorry to see the back of her. What I want to know is what in the name of heaven possessed you to go in there in the first place, and don't tell me duty. Scullery maids don't have duty in the nursery. They have orders, and you had none." Hester looked down at her red knuckles, and did not answer for a moment. "I heard him crying wrong," she said at last. "I couldn't walk past it. I wouldn't have been able to walk past it if he'd been anybody's." Mrs. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face eased, though her voice did not soften to match it. "No," she said, "I don't suppose you would." She did not thank her. Hester noticed that, and was, in a small way she did not examine too closely, grateful for it, because thanks would have meant discussing what she had done, and she had already decided, somewhere between the nursery and her bed, that she would rather no one discuss it at all. She had done it because it needed doing. She had not done it to be remarked upon, and the idea of the whole kitchen passage knowing her business, of the second footman winking at her over it, of Mrs. Dunmore's sour glare when she came in to collect her things, made her wish she had simply told no one and let the fever break in silence as it had. She would have refused a reward outright, had one been offered to her that morning. None was. What came instead, 3 days later, was a summons from Mrs. Pruitt informing her, without explanation, that she was to be moved out of the scullery and into the nursery wing as underdrudge, to fetch and carry and lay fires for whatever new nurse was engaged, at a wage 2 shillings higher than she had been drawing. She did not know, because no one told her, that the order had come directly from the Duke, in his own hand, the morning after his return, before he had so much as changed out of his travel-stained coat. She did not know that he had sat at his study desk, with the ink barely dry on his signature and written, below the instruction regarding her wage, a single further line to Mrs. Pruitt that the housekeeper had read twice and told no one about. She is not to be thanked for it, or made a show of. Only kept near them. Hester read the summons as a punishment disguised as a promotion. She had been caught overstepping her station, and now she was to be watched more closely for it, kept where an eye could be kept on her, in case she ever again forgot her place. That was how she understood it, and she went to the nursery wing that first morning, with her chin up and her hands steady, and a private resolve, entirely her own, that she would never again touch a child in that house without leave, whatever it cost her to stand by and watch. It cost her nothing, as it turned out, because leave was never withheld. The new nurse, a broad, capable Yorkshire woman, named Mrs. Fenwick, took one look at how the smallest of the 3 infants quieted the moment Hester's hands were near him, and declared, within her first week, that she would sooner lose her own right arm than lose the girl from the nursery. The Duke, for his part, did not come near the nursery again for some days. He had business, Mrs. Pruitt said, that had piled up in his absence, tenants to see, and a steward's accounts to untangle, and a great many letters that had waited 6 months for answering. Hester saw him only twice in that first fortnight, both times at a distance, crossing the courtyard in a plain dark coat, with no livery about him at all, walking fast, head down, a man clearly wishing to be spoken to by no one. She did not think of him as the Duke, exactly when she saw him like that. She thought of him, when she thought of him at all, as the tired man from the nursery doorway, the one whose voice had gone rough with the road, and whose face had done something strange and unreadable when he looked down at his smallest son. She did not connect that man, fully, with the portrait that hung at the head of the great stair, painted some years before in ceremonial robes, with a face far younger and far less lined than the one she had seen dripping rain onto her floor. It did not occur to her that they were entirely the same person, not because she was foolish, but because grief and rain and firelight had made him, that night, into something smaller and plainer than a portrait ever could, and she had never once been formally presented to him since. The fortnight passed in the ordinary business of fires laid and linens carried, and 3 infants weighed and measured and fed on schedule, and Hester found, without quite meaning to, that she had grown fond of the nursery in a way she had not expected. The smallest of the 3, whom the household had taken to calling Rowan for the colour that came into his cheeks when he cried, had a habit of quieting the instant her hand rested on his back, and Mrs. Fenwick remarked more than once, dryly, that the boy knew his own rescuer even if the rest of the house pretended not to. It was on the 12th day that she met the grave man from the doorway properly, though neither of them called it that at the time. She had gone out at first light, before the house was fully awake, to gather chamomile from the kitchen garden wall, because Rowan's stomach had been unsettled in the night, and her mother had always sworn by a week tisane of it for infant colic. The garden at that hour was hers alone, or so she believed, mist still lying low over the beds and the smell of wet earth, and box hedge thick in the cold air. And she was on her knees at the wall, with her basket half full, when a voice behind her said, without preamble, "You'll want the flowers, not the leaves." For an infant's stomach. She turned, startled, and found him standing a few feet off in the same plain dark coat, no hat, his hands loosely clasped behind him in the manner of a man out walking simply to be out of the house. She had not heard him approach at all. "Yes, sir," she said, recovering herself, and went back to picking, because it seemed the safer course than staring at him. The flowers steep gentler, leaves can turn bitter, and do more harm than good if you're not careful of the dose. You know a great deal about it. My mother did, sir. She helped a healer in our village for near 20 years before she died. I learned what I could at her elbow. And what became of the healer? Gone to his reward some years back. There's no one left in Millbrook now who knows fevers proper, save what I remember of it. She glanced up at him, briefly, and then back to the flowers, because something in his stillness made her uneasy in a way she could not name. "Forgive me, sir, I don't believe I know your name." It was, she would realise much later, an entirely honest question, asked without artifice, and it was that honesty, more than anything else in the exchange, that seemed to catch him somewhere behind the ribs. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered, as though weighing something, and when he spoke his voice was careful in a way it had not been a moment before. "I manage the grounds hereabouts," he said. It was not, strictly, a lie. "You may call me Mr. Farrow if you like." Mr. Farrow, she tried it once, to see how it sat, and went on picking flowers. entirely unaware that she had just addressed the Duke of Renwick by half his own family name, and been allowed to believe it a common surname shared by half the parish. Well, Mr. Farrow, if you've an eye to the grounds, you might tell whoever tends this wall that the chamomile wants thinning before midsummer, or it'll choke itself out. I'll see it done, he said, and there was again that brief unpractised thing at the corner of his mouth, there and gone before she could be certain of it. You are not afraid of speaking plainly to strangers, Miss Quill. I've found plain speaking wastes less of everyone's time, sir. Whether it's welcome is a different matter, and not mine to judge. It's welcome, he said, and something in the way he said it made her look up at him properly for the first time, and hold his eyes for a moment longer than was strictly proper between a maid and a man she believed to be a steward or a groundskeeper of some seniority. It is welcome more than you know. She did not know what to make of that, and so she said nothing, and gathered the last of the chamomile into her basket, and rose, brushing the damp earth from her apron. I ought to get this back before the boy wakes hungry, she said. Good morning to you, Misty, Farrow. Good morning, Miss Quill. She left him standing at the garden wall in the mist, and did not look back, and so did not see him remain there a long while after she had gone, turning the small dishonesty of the borrowed name over in his mind with something that was not quite guilt and not quite pleasure, but some uneasy cousin of both. He told himself, walking back to the house, that he had not lied to deceive her, only to see her a little longer as she was, unweighted by his rank, before the rest of the house's opinion of him settled over her, the way it settled over everyone eventually. He told himself this was reasonable. He did not examine too closely why it mattered to him so much that it should be true. That same week, without her knowledge, a letter went out from Renwick Hall to a physician in the town nearest Millbrook, instructing him to call upon a boy named Tam Quill, aged 9 years, said to suffer a weakness of the lungs, and to send his account to the hall's steward rather than to the family, and to make certain, in whatever manner he saw fit, that the family never learned who had sent him. Hester knew nothing of this. She knew only that her wages, sent home faithfully every month to the small cottage in Millbrook, where her brother Tam coughed through the winters worse each year since their mother died, seemed, somehow, to be stretching further than they ought, and she thought little of it beyond a private thankfulness that whatever thin mercy had come to her family's aid, it had come. The trouble, when it came from a direction she had not thought to watch. Lady Cressida Aldermore had been the late Duchess's elder sister, and had kept house at Renwick since her sister's death, with the settled authority of a woman who believed, quite sincerely, that her presence was the only thing standing between the estate and complete disorder. She was handsome in the hard, polished way of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her own worth, and she had a laugh that struck the ear in 3 light beats, precise as a bell rung by a gloved knuckle, and she used it most often on people she had just finished being cruel to. She had watched Hester Quill's rise from scullery to nursery with an interest that had, by the 6th week, curdled into something sharper. It was not that she suspected anything of substance. It was more simply that she disliked seeing a servant girl handled with any particular care by a household she considered hers to arrange, and disliked still more the way the smallest Farrow infant reached for the girl's hand before he reached for his own aunt's. She found her opportunity on a grey afternoon in the nursery, when Hester was kneeling on the floor with Rowan propped against her knee, coaxing him through the last of a bowl of milk pap with a patience Mrs. Fenwick had gone downstairs to praise to anyone who would listen. Lady Cressida came in without knocking, as she always did, and stood over them both for a long moment before she spoke. "You handle him as though he were yours," she said. Hester looked up, startled, and rose at once, the bowl still in her hand. "No, my lady, I only feed him, when Mrs. Fenwick's occupied with the others. How fortunate for you that occupation arises so often." Lady Cressida's eyes travelled, deliberately, over Hester's reddened hands, her plain grey dress, the darn at the hem where it had caught on a nail some months before, and never been properly mended. "You have the hands of a washerwoman, Miss Quill. I wonder that his Grace permits you so near his sons at all, when there are women in this county of proper breeding who would give a great deal for the honour." "I don't know about honour, my lady. I only know the boy takes his milk easier from someone who doesn't mind being spat on. It was said without heat, entirely without insolence." In the same plain tone she had used to discuss chamomile at the garden wall, and it landed exactly as such things always landed on a woman who had expected either tears or grovelling, and received neither. Lady Cressida's mouth thinned. "You are impertinent." "I'm tired, my lady, and the boy's hungry, and I'd not like to let his milk go cold arguing the point of my hands." Hester knelt back down and lifted the bowl again, and Rowan, sensing the change in her attention, made a small unhappy sound and reached for her sleeve. "If you'll excuse me." Lady Cressida did not excuse her. She stood a moment longer, her three-beat laugh escaping her once, short and cold, entirely without humour in it. "We shall see how long his Grace finds you an amusement, girl. Men of his rank tire of novelty quickly enough. Once the season turns, and there are women of consequence again to occupy him." She left without waiting for an answer, and Hester knelt on the nursery floor with the bowl in her lap and her hands, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not quite steady. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago not to cry where it showed, but that night, lying awake in the narrow bed she shared with no one, she thought about her hands, and had darned him, and the word novelty, and understood, with a plain, clear ache that surprised her by how much it hurt, that whatever small, unlooked-for happiness she had begun to feel in that nursery was built on ground that did not, in the eyes of the house that mattered, belong to her at all. She did not know that the grave man from the garden wall had heard, from Mrs. Pruitt, an account of the exchange within the hour, and had gone very still and very quiet in his study for a long while afterward, in a manner the housekeeper had learned, over 11 years, to recognise as the particular silence of a man deciding something he did not yet trust himself to say aloud. The days that followed settled into a strange and careful rhythm, the kind that comes after a small storm has passed, but before anyone is certain whether a larger one is building behind it. Hester kept to her work, and said nothing more of Lady Cressida's visit to anyone, not even Mrs. Fenwick, who had a way of extracting confidences from the air itself, and had to be firmly turned aside twice before she abandoned the effort. Hester's private accounting of the matter was simple. She had been warned. She intended to heed the warning, insofar as it meant keeping her head down and her opinions to herself, and she told herself this with more conviction than she felt. She saw the man she knew as Mr. Farrow twice more that fortnight, both times by what seemed to her entire accident, though it was not accident at all. He found her once at the stable yard, where she had gone to fetch a pail of fresh milk for the nursery, and walked with her part way back to the house, asking after her brother in a manner so unassuming she thought nothing of answering him fully. "He's mending, sir. Thank you for asking. The doctor in town has been kinder than I'd any right to expect for what little we can pay him." She shifted the pail to her other hand. There's talk in the village that someone's been settling half the bill quiet, though no one knows who, and I don't like to ask too hard in case the asking stops it. Wise, he said, and something in his voice made her glance at him, though his face gave nothing away. Some kindnesses do better unexamined. That's near what my mother used to say. She'd never let us thank a body properly for a favour, said it only embarrassed the giver and made the next kindness harder to offer. She smiled, briefly, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it did something to his composure that he was grateful the milk pail gave him an excuse to look away from. I expect I'm the same. I'd rather not be thanked for anything I do, if it's all the same. It only makes a plain thing feel like it wanted an audience. And if the thing was never meant for an audience at all, he said slowly, but was seen regardless. What then? Then I suppose the one who saw it ought to keep it to himself, sir, unless there's real cause to speak. Watching a good thing done doesn't give a man the right to make a show of it. It only gives him the responsibility of not spoiling it. He did not answer that for a long moment, and when he did, his voice had gone rougher than the conversation seemed to warrant. That is, I think, the wisest thing anyone has said to me in 6 months. She did not know why he looked, just then so much like a man forgiven something he had not confessed, and she did not ask, because asking was not. She had long ago decided, any of her business, whoever he turned out to be. The second meeting came at the churchyard the following Sunday, brief and public, and entirely without private words, no more than a nod exchanged across the green. But Lady Cressida saw it, from the church steps, and her eyes narrowed in a manner that boded no good for anyone. She did not have to wait long to act on it. The accusation came on a wet Tuesday, 8 weeks after the fever night, delivered not to Hester directly, but to Mrs. Fenwick, who brought it to Hester with a face gone grey and careful, the expression of a woman bearing news she does not believe, but cannot yet disprove. Lady Cressida says a locket's gone missing from the Duchess's old dressing-case, Mrs. Fenwick said, low, glancing at the door as though it might carry the words further than she intended. Silver, with a portrait inside. She says it was seen last in the nursery wing, in your keeping. Hester's hands went still over the linen she was folding. I've never touched the Duchess's dressing-case in my life, Mrs. Fenwick. I wouldn't know where it's kept. I believe you, girl, but belief's not proof, and her ladyship's already spoken to Mrs. Pruitt about having your room searched. The search found nothing, because there was nothing to find, but the accusation itself did its work regardless, the way a stain does its work, whether or not the garment is ever proven dirty. It moved through the house in whispers by supper, embroidered a little further at every telling, until by the time it reached the servants' hall it had grown from a missing locket into a settled certainty that the nursery girl who had risen too fast had reached, at last, for something that was not hers to take. Hester bore it the way she bore everything. She did not weep in front of anyone. She did not protest loudly or beg to be believed. She went about her work with her chin level and her hands steady, and answered every sideways glance with a plainness that gave the gossips nothing further to chew on. And at night, alone, she allowed herself exactly as much grief as she could manage, without letting it show on her face by morning. But she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the accusation itself, that she could not stay in a house where a lie like that could be spoken over her, and believed by enough people to matter, not without it costing something dearer than her pride. She thought of Tam, coughing through his winters in Millbrook, dependent on wages she could not afford to lose to a scandal not of her making. She thought of Rowan, who had learned to reach for her hand before anyone else's, and who would not understand, being not yet a year old, why the hand simply stopped coming one day. She made her decision on the Thursday, in the grey hour before dawn, sitting at the small table in her room with a stub of pencil and a single sheet of paper she could ill afford to waste. She wrote to Mrs. Pruitt, not to the Duke, because she did not believe herself entitled to trouble a Duke's time with a scullery girl's resignation, and the letter was short and plain and gave no account of the locket at all, because she had long ago decided that defending herself to people determined not to believe her was a waste of breath better spent elsewhere. "I am grateful for the chance I was given here," she wrote, "and I have done nothing to be ashamed of in the nursery or anywhere else in this house. But I think it best for everyone concerned if I go home to my brother now, before matters grow worse than they need to. Please tell the boys, when they are old enough to understand such things, that I was glad of every hour I spent with them, and that I would have done for them what I did whether they had been born to a duke or to no one at all." She folded the letter and did not sign it with any flourish, and left it on Mrs. Pruitt's table before the house was fully awake, and by the time the first bell rang for breakfast, she was already on the road toward Millbrook with a single bag and a heart that felt, she thought, a good deal heavier than the bag did. Mrs. Pruitt found the letter at 7:30 and read it twice before she said a single word to anyone, and then she went, not to the Duke's study, where he would ordinarily have been found at that hour, but to the nursery where he had taken, of late, to sitting with his sons for a quarter-hour each morning before the business of the estate claimed him entirely. She did not soften what she had to tell him. 11 years of service had taught her that softening bad news only lengthened the pain of hearing it. "The Quill girl's gone, Your Grace. Left before dawn, on account of Lady Cressida's talk of a missing locket." She held out the letter without further preamble. "I've had the dressing-case searched myself, top to bottom, twice over. The locket was never missing at all. Her ladyship had moved it to her own rooms herself a fortnight back, and forgot she'd done it. I found it not 10 minutes ago in her own jewel-case, plain as day." He read the letter standing, and read it again sitting, and Mrs. Pruitt watched something move across his face that she had not seen there since before the Duchess died. A stillness that was not calm at all, but its exact opposite, held very carefully in check. "How long has she been gone?" 2 hours, perhaps a little more. She'd have taken the early carrier's cart from the crossroads if she meant to reach Millbrook by dark. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, and it was then, watching him cross the room with a speed she had not seen in him in half a year, that Mrs. Pruitt decided the moment had come to say the other things she had been carrying for some weeks, the things she had promised him she would not say unless it became necessary. "Your Grace, before you go, there's a thing that girl doesn't know, and I think, if you mean to go after her, you'd best know I've half a mind to tell her myself if you don't get there first." He stopped at the door and looked back at her. She doesn't know Mr. Farrow, the man who tends the grounds and asks after her brother and quotes her own mother's wisdom back to her in the garden of a morning, is the same man whose portrait hangs over the great stair. She doesn't know who's been paying her brother's doctor these 2 months, or who wrote the order that moved her out of the scullery the very morning after that fever broke. She doesn't know any of it, Your Grace, because you never told her, and I think it's past time somebody did. Before she reaches Millbrook, believing this house never valued her at all." He was silent a long moment, his hand still on the door frame. "I meant to tell her myself," he said at last, low, when the time was right. The time, your grace, if you'll forgive my plainness, was several weeks ago. Go and tell her now, before there's no telling left to do. He found her at the crossroads, not yet arrived at the carrier's cart, sitting on a low stone wall with her bag at her feet and her face turned toward the road home, and he came on horseback at a pace that startled the crows out of the hedgerow, and drew up so hard the horse half reared and swung down before it had fully stopped. She rose when she saw him, and for one confused moment took him, from the fine horse and the urgency of his approach, for someone else entirely, before the truth of it settled over her all at once, cold and complete, the way truth sometimes does. "You're him," she said. "Not a question. You're the Duke." "Yes, you let me call you Mr. Farrow. You let me talk to you about chamomile and my brother and my mother's sayings as though you were a groundskeeper. And all the while you were," she stopped, because her voice had begun, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to shake, and she would not let it go further than that. "Why?" He stood a few feet from her in the wet road, hat in his hand, and did not come closer, because some instinct told him she needed the distance more than she needed comfort just then. "Because I wanted to see who you were when you believed no one of consequence was watching," he said. "I saw it the first night, in the nursery, before you ever knew my name, and I wanted, God forgive me for the vanity of it, to go on seeing it a little longer before the whole weight of what I am came down between us and changed how you spoke to me. It was selfish. I understand that now. I did not understand it clearly enough at the time. You had a doctor sent to my brother. You had my wages raised, and told no one, and let me believe it was Mrs. Pruitt's ordinary kindness. You let Lady Cressida call me a thief in front of the whole house, and said nothing, and now you ride after me on the road like— I said nothing because I did not know, until this morning, that she had said it at all." His voice, for the first time since she had known him under any name, was not entirely steady. "I would have stopped it the moment I heard. I am stopping it now. The locket was never missing. Lady Cressida moved it herself and forgot. Mrs. Pruitt found it in her own jewel case not 2 hours past. Hester was very still, the way she went still when she did not trust her own voice to hold. Then I was never accused of anything but the truth I already knew about myself, that I don't belong in that house, whatever kindness gets shown me in secret. A duke doesn't ride after a scullery maid on a public road, your grace, not for any reason the world would call proper. I am not riding after a scullery maid, he said. I am riding after the only person in 6 months who has told me the truth without once asking what it might earn her. I did not come to command you back to Renwick. I came because I could not let you walk to Millbrook, believing this house never saw what you were, when in truth it is the only thing it has seen clearly since I came home. She looked at him for a long moment, her bag still at her feet, the road empty behind them both, and did not answer, because she did not yet know what to say to a truth so much larger than the one she had left the house believing. I won't ask you to come back today, he said, when the silence had stretched long enough that a lesser man might have filled it with more words than the moment could bear. I won't ask you to come back at all, if Millbrook and your brother are where you'd rather be. I have no right to ask you anything, having given you every reason these 2 months to distrust the little I told you of myself. But I would ask you to hear the rest of it, before you decide, in a room with a fire in it, and not on a wet road with your bag already packed for leaving. She looked down the road toward Millbrook, and then back at him, and something in her chest, some tight thing that had been held closed since Mrs. Fenwick's grey-faced warning, loosened a little, though not entirely, not yet. 1 hour, she said, for the fire's sake, and no other reason. 1 hour, he agreed, and it was, she thought, the nearest thing to relief she had ever seen cross that grave face. The room he brought her to was not his study, and not the grand drawing-room where Lady Cressida held her afternoon callers, but a small parlour at the back of the house that Hester had never once entered in 2 months of service, low-ceilinged and warm, with a fire already built up high against the wet morning, and 2 chairs drawn close to it, as though someone had prepared the room in advance for exactly this conversation. Which? She would learn later someone had. He did not sit at once. He stood by the mantel with his back half to her, his hand resting on the cold stone of it, and when he spoke it was with the careful, unhurried plainness of a man who has rehearsed a confession many times in his own head, and is only now discovering how much harder it is to say aloud than it was to compose in silence. "My wife died delivering our sons," he said. "You know that much already, I imagine. The whole county knows it. What you do not know is that I left this house 3 days after we buried her and did not come back for 6 months, and that in all that time I could not bring myself to write more than instructions to my steward, because every letter I began to my own sons turned, somehow, into a letter to her instead." Hester sat very still in the chair he had gestured her toward, her hands folded in her lap, and said nothing, because she understood, with the particular instinct she had for silences that wanted to be filled by the speaker alone, that this was not a moment for her to answer yet. "I came home the night of the fever because I dreamed of it. I know how that sounds. I do not care how it sounds. I woke in an inn 40 miles from here entirely certain that if I did not ride through the night I would lose the last thing I had left of her, and I rode, and I arrived, and I stood in that doorway, and watched a woman I had never met kneeling on my own floor, doing for my son what I had been too broken to do myself for half a year." His hand tightened on the mantel. I did not step forward. I told myself it was because I did not wish to frighten you, and that was true. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I could not move, because I had not seen anything so plainly good, done so entirely without thought of reward, in longer than I could remember, and I did not want to spoil it by announcing myself into it. "You could have told me the next morning," she said, quietly, "or the week after, or any of the mornings in the garden. I could have. I did not, and I have turned over the reasons for it more times than I can tell you. Some of it was cowardice, I think. If I told you who I was, you would have treated me the way the whole world treats a duke. And I had gone 6 months starved for a single conversation that was not shaped by what I am. You gave me that, without knowing you were giving it, every time you spoke to me plainly at that garden wall. I was greedy for it. I did not want to lose it before I had to." He turned from the mantel at last and looked at her directly. "That is not an excuse, Miss Quill. I know it is not. It is only the truth, which you are, I think, the one person in this house who has ever asked me to give her without decoration." She was quiet for a long moment, turning this over the way she turned over everything, slowly and completely, before she let herself respond to any part of it. "You had the doctor sent for Tam before you ever spoke to me in the garden," she said at last. "Before the fever night even. Mrs. Pruitt as good as told me the wages were raised the very morning after, though I didn't understand then what I was being told." "Yes, why, you didn't know me yet. Not properly. You'd seen 1 night's work and nothing else." I had seen the only thing that has ever mattered to me in judging a person's worth, he said. Not their birth, not their manners, not what they can be persuaded to do when they know they are watched and rewarded for it. What they do when they believe themselves entirely alone, with nothing to gain, and no one of consequence to see it. You did not know I was a duke. You did not know anyone of any consequence was watching at all, and you gave everything you had to a child who could not have thanked you if he tried, because he was 6 months old and fevered near to dying, and you asked nothing in return, and were embarrassed, I think, that anyone should even remark on it afterward. I have met a great many people in my life who behave beautifully when they know the world is watching. I had never, until that night, met anyone who behaved that way, when she believed it was only her and the dark. Hester's hands in her lap were not quite steady, and she pressed them flat against her skirt to still them, and did not entirely succeed. "I don't know what you want from me, Your Grace." "Nothing," he said, and it came out rougher than he meant it to, and he stopped and steadied himself before he went on. "That is the truest answer I can give you. I do not want anything from you that you are not entirely free to refuse. I am not going to ask you to stay at Renwick out of gratitude, or obligation, or because a duke has asked, and a scullery maid does not ordinarily find it easy to say no to one. I would rather have your no, freely given, than any yes you felt you owed me for a doctor's bill, or a raised wage, or a horse ridden hard down a wet road. If you wish to go to Millbrook, and never see this house again, I will have you driven there myself, in comfort, and I will make certain Lady Cressida troubles neither you nor your brother's good name ever again. That is not conditional on anything you say to me in this room." She looked at him for a long moment, the fire cracking softly between them, and when she spoke her voice, though quiet, did not shake at all. "And if I wished to stay, not out of gratitude, because I wanted to, then I would ask you to stay as something other than a scullery maid," he said, "because I do not think, having said all this aloud, that I could go back to watching you carry coal and lay fires in a house where I have just told you the truth of what I feel. But I will not press that either. It is enough, for today, that you know the whole of it. The rest can wait as long as you need it to." She rose from her chair then, slowly, and crossed the small distance between them, and stood before him with her red, work-roughened hands loose at her sides, and looked up into a face she had known for 2 months as a groundskeeper's, and now knew, all at once, entirely differently. "I don't want a title," she said. "I never wanted one, and I'll not pretend otherwise to make this easier. I want to be spoken to plainly, always, whatever it costs either of us to say the plain thing. I want never to be lied to again, not even the kind of lie that seems kind in the moment. And I want Tam brought here, near me, where I can see to him myself, doctor or no doctor, because I'll not build a happiness on the far side of the county from the only family I have left." "Agreed," he said, without a single second's hesitation, on every point. She held out her hand to him then, not for him to kiss, but simply to shake, in the plain manner of two people concluding an honest bargain, and he took it instead in both of his, and drew off, very slowly, finger by finger, the worn glove she wore even indoors to hide the redness of her knuckles, and set it aside, and held her bare hand in his as though it were the finest thing he had ever been given, which, in a manner of speaking, it was. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did that night, and every night since, for children who could not have repaid you, and never once asked you to. Thank you," she said, "for standing in the doorway and not stepping forward. If you'd announced yourself, I'd never have known the man before I knew the Duke. And I think I'd have liked him a great deal less for it. They were married in the small stone church at Millbrook, rather than the grander one nearer Renwick, because Hester asked for it, quietly, and he granted it without argument, and the wedding was small enough that the county gossips complained for a full season afterward that a duke's marriage ought to have made more of a spectacle of itself. Lady Cressida was not present. She had removed to a house in Bath within the month, her authority at Renwick quietly and permanently ended, and the letters she wrote afterward, twice a year at Christmas and at midsummer, were read once by Mrs. Pruitt and set unopened into the fire thereafter, at Hester's own calm instruction, given without malice and without a single raised word. Tam Quill came to live at Renwick before the leaves turned that year, and grew stronger in the clean country air and the attentions of a doctor no longer secret, and by the following spring he could be found most afternoons in the nursery himself, teaching the triplets, now toddling and loud and entirely recovered, games he remembered from his own small childhood in Millbrook. A year to the day from the night of the fever, they sat together by the same nursery fire, though it had long since been refurnished with 2 chairs drawn close instead of one woman kneeling alone on bare boards. Rowan, sturdy now and red-cheeked with health rather than fever, slept against his father's shoulder while his brothers wrestled a wooden horse between them on the rug. Hester sat with her bare hand laced through the Duke's, no glove between them any more in that room or any other, and neither of them spoke for a long while, because there was, by then, no need to fill every silence with words. "You never did tell me," she said at last, watching the fire, "what you were dreaming, that night, that brought you home in such a hurry." "I don't remember the dream itself any more," he said, "only that I woke certain I would lose something if I did not ride. I thought for a long time it was Rowan I was meant to save. I understand now it was something else entirely." She looked at him, and did not ask him to finish the thought, because his hand, tightening gently around hers in the firelight, said the rest of it plainly enough. Outside, a rook called once from the bare branches above the drive, the same call that had sounded the night the fever broke, and neither of them remarked on it, because some things, once understood, do not need remarking on again. It is not what a person does when the world is watching that tells you who they are. It is what they do, quietly, when they believe no one of consequence ever will.